"Put her at the back," said the Duke of Cranmere, and he did not trouble to lower his voice to say it. "A name is not a freehold. The Ansells have nothing now but the name, and that seat is spoken for." The whole of St. Chad's Church at Wychmere heard him, because he had meant the whole church to hear him. It was a bright Sunday at the end of harvest, and the sun came through the clear glass of the south windows and lay in long white bars across the new pavement he had paid for. Judith Ansell was standing where her family had stood on Sunday mornings for 200 years, with her gloved hand on the brass ring of the second pew in the chancel, and the door of it already open under her fingers. Old Purbrick, the pew opener, came up the aisle behind her with his hat crushed in both hands and would not look higher than her elbow. "Miss Ansell," he said, "there has been a reordering. Mr. Kelso, the Duke's land agent, went past her in a coat that had cost more than her whole year, sat down in her seat, and arranged the tails of it about him. He did not look at her either. He had been in the house at Wall End 9 years before to value her mother's furniture, and he had a good memory for chairs. It is 14 paces from the chancel step to the tower arch at Wychmere. Judith Ansell walked them with her father on her arm, and she did not hurry, because hurrying would have made it a rout instead of a walk. 200 faces turned as they came. The blacksmith looked at the floor. The Dorset girls put their heads together. Somebody in the Duke's party, one of the 2 gentlemen up from London for the shooting, let out a short laugh and swallowed it, and the swallowing was louder in that church than the laugh had been. Purbrick showed them the free bench under the tower, by the door, where the draught came in and the parish poor sat, the shoemaker Dunning and his family, 2 old men out of the almshouse, and Ruth Prentice, who kept a pig in a lean-to and smelled of it. Ruth Prentice moved along the bench without being asked, and made a space, and dusted it with her sleeve, and that was the only courtesy anybody in that building offered the Ansells that morning. There were no books at the back. The parish poor were not expected to read, so when the psalm came, Thomas Ansell stood up in the draught by the door and sang it from memory in a good, dry, accurate voice, all 6 verses, while his daughter stood beside him with her hands folded and her eyes on the back of the Duke of Cranmere's head. A stranger might not have understood what had been done. In an English parish, a seat was not a convenience. It was a statement of who a family was, written in oak, read every Sunday by everyone who mattered. The Ansells had held the second pew in the chancel since a Thomas Ansell had endorsed the churchwarden's book 2 centuries earlier and cut his initials into the door with a knife. They had lost their land in her grandfather's time to a suit in chancery that nobody now remembered the merits of. They had lost the house at Wall End to a creditor. They had lost the carriage, the plate, the field called Long Lie, and the right to be asked to dinner anywhere above the vicarage. What they had left entirely was 14 paces of oak flooring and a door with 2 letters cut in it. The Duke had not needed the seat. He had a family pew across the aisle the size of a small room, with its own fireplace and its own stove and a curtain on brass rings. He gave the Ansell pew to his agent because the church was being reordered at his charge, and because Kelso had asked for something for his trouble, and because it had genuinely not occurred to Edmund, Duke of Cranmere, that a pew in his own parish church could belong to anybody in any sense that need concern him. By dinner time the whole valley had it. By Michaelmas it had reached 3 counties, in the form of a story people repeated with a laugh and a small wince at the end of the laugh. The reordering went forward that week. It was a handsome thing, and the parish was grateful for it, and the parish said so. New lead on the nave roof. New pavement of Purbeck stone laid the whole length of the chancel, level and beautiful. A new vault cut beneath it for the Cranmere dead, brick-lined, with an iron door. And, coming down from London by wagon in the spring, a monument to the Duke's late father in white Carrara marble, a draped urn and a mourning figure, 9 feet from the plinth to the crown of her head, at a cost of £900. The old chancel woodwork came out to make room, 400 years of black oak, and was burnt in the churchyard on a Tuesday in a fire that smoked all day and left a scorched ring in the grass that would not green over for 3 summers. Job Hallett, the parish carpenter, took the panels off himself, because the work was his, and the money was good, and he had a family. But before the fire was lit, he put the door of the Ansell pew on his shoulder and carried it home down the lane, and made it the top of the bench in his shop, initials down, where it took 9 years of shavings and glue and dogs sleeping under it. Thomas Ansell died before Candlemas, of the wet and of being old, in 2 rooms over the wheelwright's shop. He had not once mentioned the pew, and that was how his daughter knew what it had done to him. The Ansells had a right of burial in the chancel. 3 generations of them lay under the second bay, and the entry was in the register in the vicar's own hand. Judith Ansell asked for it, and was told to wait, and waited, and was told again. And on the 3rd day, the sexton came to the door with his hat off, and said that the new pavement was not to be broken. He said it the way a man says a sentence he has been given to carry. So Thomas Ansell was buried outside the north wall, on the shadowed side, where the grass grew rank and the water stood in winter, and the parish put strangers, and paupers, and those about whom questions could not be answered. The Reverend Sillastorian read the service in the sleet and shook so badly at the committal that he lost his place twice. He had £80 a year, a wife, and no living of his own, and he had said nothing in the church in September, and he would carry that. Judith Ansell sold what was left. It came to £11 and some shillings, a bureau, 6 chairs, a warming pan, her father's Latin books to a dealer in Salisbury who paid by weight. She kept 2 things. One was her mother's shawl, deep crimson wool, good, and the only garment she owned that anybody would have looked at twice. The other was her father's copy of the parish register entries, made out in his hand for the vicar's convenience, in which the Ansell burials in the chancel were recorded going back 200 years. Then she got on the London coach, and Wychmere did not see her again for 9 years. She went to Mr. Abel Chenery, a proctor of Doctors' Commons, who had corresponded with her father for 11 years about the parish register, and had never met him. Doctors' Commons was the quiet, dusty, immensely profitable corner of the law that dealt with wills, marriages, ships, and the property of the Church of England, and Chenery took her on to copy at first, because her hand was better than his clerk's, and he was ashamed of his clerks. She copied 10 hours a day in a room over a chandler's in Knightrider Street for 18 shillings a week. She copied bills and answers and depositions in causes about the tithe of hops in Kent, the tithe of milk in Cheshire, the tithe of a windmill that had been built on land that had once grown barley. She copied faculties for the moving of monuments and citations and the sworn terriers of 400 parishes. And somewhere in the 3rd year, without meaning to. She stopped copying the words and began reading them. She did not write to Wychmere in all that time, and Wychmere did not write to her, except once a year at Christmas, when Silas Dorian sent 3 lines to say that the grave outside the north wall was kept, and that he had cut the grass on it himself. She answered each of those letters with 3 lines back, and neither of them ever once mentioned the other thing. She grew older in that room over the chandlers. Her hand got faster, and then it got beautiful. Chenery raised her wages twice without being asked, and began, without announcing that he was doing it, to give her the causes he had no patience for himself, the terriers, the ancient compositions, the moduli, the long dull disputes about who owned what in a church, and had owned it since before anybody could remember. This was what she learned, and it was not a secret. It was merely a thing that nobody in Wychmere had ever had a reason to look up. At the dissolution of the monasteries, the tithes of a great many English parishes had been split in 2 and sold off. The small tithes, the pigs and the eggs and the garden stuff, stayed with the vicar, who did the work and christened the children and buried the dead for whatever the small tithes came to. The great tithes, the corn and the hay and the wood, the valuable 10th, went to whoever had bought the abbey's share from the crown. A layman, an impropriator, a lay rector. And with the great tithes went the chancel. Not the church, the parish owned the nave and the tower and the bells. The chancel, the holy end, the floor, the walls, the roof and the east window belonged to the lay rector, and belonged to him as absolutely as his own hat, and he was bound in law to keep it in repair forever. The lands of Wychmere Abbey had gone to the Cranmeres. The rectory of Wychmere had gone in the same year to a Devon family named Tremaine, and had stayed with them ever since, collected by agents never once visited. 4 dukes of Cranmere had tried to buy it back. 4 dukes of Cranmere had failed. It was the one thing in that valley the family did not own, and the present duke had spent £1,100 cutting a vault and laying a pavement in a chancel that was not his, and had never once asked whose it was, because he had never once had to ask anybody anything. In the 5th year, the Tremaine papers came across Judith Ansell's desk, and she asked Chenery for the business, and got it. Crispin Tremaine was the last of them, a blind old gentleman in 2 rooms in Bath, with a housekeeper who read him the newspaper, a chancery suit that had eaten his estate, and an income he could not account for. His agent, a Mr. Oadby, had collected the Wychmere tithes for 19 years, and had returned him an average of £190 a year. It took her 4 months and the compounding books to prove that the tithes had been worth better than 500, and that Mr. Oadby had been keeping the difference, and that he had been doing it with the assistance of the Duke of Cranmere's land agent. Because that was the arrangement, and it was written down in Kelso's own hand in the letter book, in the way that men who have never been asked a question write things down. The home farm of Cranmere Abbey, the downland, and the 700 acres of the lay plantations, all of them tithable, all of them improved and enclosed and worth £380 of great tithe a year, were compounded at £45. In exchange, Mr. Oadby's other arrangements were not inquired into, and Mr. Oadby had the Duke's business at 3 other places. Oadby was dismissed, and £640 was got back from him. Crispin Tremaine asked who had found it, and was told, and asked for her to be sent down to Bath, and thanked her in a room with the shutters closed because the light hurt him, and then said that he wished to be rid of Wychmere altogether, because there was an offer on his table. The offer was £6,000 from Mr. Kelso by his Grace's direction. It was accompanied by an observation, expressed with great regret, that the chancel at Wychmere was reported to be in a ruinous condition, that the liability for its repair rested by law upon Mr. Tremaine and upon his heirs, and that his Grace would of course feel himself bound to see that the Archdeacon was not left in ignorance of it. £6,000 in short, or a bill of unknown size for a building the old man had never seen. Judith Ansell read it aloud to him twice, because he asked her to. Then she told him what his property was actually worth. She told him the honest annual value once the composition was set right, and the year's purchase such a thing fetched, and she put the figure at £9,000, and she told him she wanted it, and that she had £211 in the world. He laughed for the first time in that room. Then he sold it to her at £9,000, the full figure of her own valuation, 500 down, and the remainder secured on the tithes themselves by bond at 5%, and he did not take a shilling off it for friendship, because she had told him she would not sign if he did. Chenery lent her 300 against her note, and went surety for the bond, having watched her work for 9 years, and formed a view. That spring the house at Wall End came into the market at £380. She had been putting money aside for it since her 2nd year in London. She let it go, and it went to a corn factor from Devizes, and she signed the conveyance of the rectory of Wychmere on a Thursday, and cried once privately about the house, and never mentioned it to anybody afterwards. She came home on the carrier's cart in her mother's crimson shawl, with a deed, a bond, and the key of the tithe barn, which belonged to the rectory, and had belonged to it since before the Cranmeres existed. The notice went out over her own name. Judith Ansell, lay rector of the parish of Wychmere, would take the great tithes in kind or by composition at the tithe barn on the Monday after Michaelmas. She sat in the open doorway of that barn with the light behind her, and the whole parish came through it, and she dealt with them one at a time, and it took 11 hours. From the cottage gardens and the pig keepers and the widows she took nothing at all, and had it entered in the book as nothing, so that it could not afterwards be called a favour. From the small farms she took the old figure. From the 4 great farms she took the value, as surveyed by Mr. Rowe of Salisbury, and 3 of them grumbled and paid, and 1 of them argued for an hour and paid. And she added £20 a year to the Reverend Silas Dorian's stipend out of the great tithes, which she was not obliged to do, and which she did without a word said, and which made him put his hand over his eyes in the vestry. The last name in the book was Cranmere. It was entered at £380. Kelso brought the notice up to the abbey on a tray with the letters. The Duke read it, and asked who Ansell was, and Kelso began to say that it appeared to be a woman, and got no further, because the Duke had put the paper down. "The pew," he said. Kelso waited. "The woman from the pew," said the Duke of Cranmere. He had remembered her for 9 years. He had never once said so aloud, and he did not say so now. But there is a particular kind of memory a man keeps of a thing he did that nobody has ever made him answer for, and Edmund Cranmere had been carrying a straight back and a crimson shawl walking away down the length of his own church since the September of the reordering, and he had dealt with it the way such men do, by being certain, whenever it surfaced, that it had been a trifle. He sent Kelso with 5,000, and then with 7, and then with a figure that would have paid off her bond twice over. The answer came back the same each time, in a clear copyist's hand, 3 lines long, and the last line was always the same: the rectory of Wychmere is not for sale. So he came down to the church himself on the last Sunday in October, which was the first time in 9 years that Edmund Cranmere had stood on the same acre of ground as Judith Ansell. She was out on the gravel path between the south porch and the lich gate, after the service, in her mother's crimson shawl over a grey stuff gown, with the deed in her hands, because Mr. Rowe wanted the rectory boundary walked, and the schedule was written into it, and the iron key of the tithe barn on her other palm. Half the parish was still standing about on the grass in the sun. He came across the churchyard with his hat off and his agent behind him, and he did not manage it well. He had come to be reasonable, and he was reasonable for about 9 words. Then something in the way she simply stood there and waited, without hurrying him, without helping him, without the smallest flicker of triumph anywhere in her face, took the top off a temper that had never in his life been tried, and he shouted at her in front of 60 people. What did she want? He asked it with his mouth wide open and his hand thrown out palm up. He had offered her 5,000, and 7, and then more than she had given for the whole rectory, and she had answered him 3 lines at a time like a clerk answering a tradesman. What did she want? Would she have the goodness to name it out loud, in plain words, and be done? She did not move at all while he shouted. She was aware of the churchwarden with his hand half over his mouth, and of Ruth Prentice, and of Job Hallett standing at the gate with his arms folded and his hat in his fist. She let him get all the way to the end of it. "Nothing, Your Grace," she said, and it carried perfectly well, because she did not need to raise her voice once he had stopped using his. "There is nothing you have that I want. That is the whole of the difficulty." Then she went past him to walk the boundary with Mr. Rowe, and left the Duke of Cranmere standing on the gravel in front of his own parish with his hat in his hand. The archdeacon came at the visitation as archdeacons did, and the chancel of Wychmere was presented as ruinous, and the presentment was made by the Duke's churchwarden, and it was not stopped. She had expected it. She had budgeted £200 for the roof, and she had the £200. Then Mr. Rowe opened the ceiling. Every principal rafter in that chancel was hollow. The beetle had been in the oak for a generation, and the ends were rotten in the wall, and the north wall itself was 2 inches out of upright, and the tracery of the east window was cracked from sill to head, and the estimate when it came was £1,840, and it was not age. Rowe put the cause in a single sentence at the foot of his report, in the flat way of a man who does not care whose name is on the other end of it. To cut the new vault, the footing had been taken out under the north wall for 11 feet and made good in brick. To lay the new pavement, the floor had been raised 4 inches, and the old drain that ran out under the north side had been filled. The churchyard on that side had been levelled at the same time. The water that had run away from that wall for 400 years now stood against it, and had stood against it for 9 winters, and the works lately done at the charge of His Grace had very greatly hastened the decay. So the arithmetic sat on her table and did not move. £1,840 to repair damage he had done, to a building she was bound in law, to keep up in order to house his dead. Against £425 a year of interest on a bond, and a clear income after it of a little over 200. If she did not do it, the court would sequester the tithes, and the work would be done out of them, and the bond would fall in, and the rectory of Wychmere would come to sale within 18 months, and Kelso would buy it at half of what she had paid, and 4 dukes of failure would be redeemed by the 5th. He did not have to lift a finger, he only had to wait and be sorry in public and wait. And there was a second thing in Rose's report, and she read it 4 times. To underpin the north wall and relay the floor, the pavement had to come up. The whole of it, the beautiful, level, unbreakable pavement. She could put her father in the chancel. She had the right, she had the register entry in his own hand. The floor was coming up anyway, and Job Hallett had already said he would make the case himself and take nothing for it. She could do it in a fortnight. And she could not afford the roof over it, and if she lost the roof, she lost the floor. And if she lost the floor, she would have moved him twice for nothing. That was the week she went back to the compounding books. £45 a year, against a surveyed value of 380. Not a bargain, not a custom, not an old figure that everybody had forgotten to look at. A private arrangement between 2 agents, one of whom had been dismissed for theft, recorded in a letterbook in exchange for silence about that theft. Tithes wrongfully subtracted from the rector of the parish, recoverable with the arrears. She filed her bill in the Court of Exchequer for the tithes of the home farm, the downland and the lay plantations, for 6 years back at the true value, £2,010. A woman suing a duke for tithe made the newspapers, which was the first thing she had wanted least. The defense was conducted with great skill. It was said that the rectory had been bought as a speculation by a person of no property, with money borrowed at 5%, that the composition of £45 was ancient, and had been accepted by the Tremaines for 19 years without a word, and that the new lay rector of Wychmere, having begun with the abbey, would proceed in due course to the cottage gardens and the potato patches, and the widow's pig. The parish answered that. 19 farmers of Wychmere came up and swore to their compositions, and to the entries against the gardens in the book, which said nothing, and were signed, and were dated the first Monday after Michaelmas in each year. Ruth Prentice, who had never in her life been in a room with more than 4 people in it, said that she had been asked for nothing at all, and had asked what she was to do with the pig, and had been told to keep the pig. Silas Dorian swore to the augmentation of his stipend, and then, unasked and against advice, swore to what had been done in his church in September 9 years before, and to a burial outside the north wall, and to the reason given for it, and to his own silence, which he described as the worst thing he had ever done. And Kelso's letter book was read in open court. Not the parts about the tithe, the parts about the chancel. The letter to Bath was read entire. The ruinous condition, the liability at law, the great regret, the archdeacon who would not be left in ignorance. £6,000 or a bill of unknown size to a blind old man in 2 rooms over a roof that his Grace's own vault had rotted. The Duke of Cranmere was in court that day. He had come to be seen not minding. 4 words in that letter went into him and stayed, by his Grace's direction. He had directed nothing. He had never seen it, never dictated it, never signed it. He had said, at some point at breakfast, over a newspaper, that Kelso had better get on with Wychmere. And Kelso had got on with it, and everything that had followed had gone out into the world with his name on the front of it and his ignorance behind it, and that was precisely and exactly what he had done to a woman standing at the door of a pew. He had not looked, and other men had carried it out, and the parish had laughed. He withdrew the defence the next morning. The decree went for the plaintiff at £2,010 and costs, and it was paid within the week, without a day's grace asked for. Then he wrote to her offering to pay for the chancel entire, roof, wall, window and floor, at his own charge, and to add £1,000 for the trouble. She refused it, and her refusal was 4 lines long. The chancel of Wychmere was hers. The liability was hers. It was the one thing about her position that could not be bought, sold, lent or forgiven, and she declined to have it taken off her hands by the man whose vault had caused it. He might, she wrote, feel free to attend the works. The chancel of Wychmere stood open to the sky for 2 summers. The monuments came down and were stored in the nave under sacking, all of them, marble urn and mourning figure, and the whole 9 feet of Carrara. The vault was opened, underpinned, made good and closed, and nothing in it was disturbed. The old drain was dug out and run clear of the wall again, and the churchyard on the north side was cut back to the level it had held for 4 centuries, which meant that the water came off it properly for the first time in 9 years, which meant that a grave outside the north wall stopped standing in water in the winter. The roof went on in oak from the lay plantations, 412 trees having been felled there to pay for a marble monument. She bought the timber she needed from the Duke's own woodwork at the full market price and paid for it out of the decree, and she made the woodwork take a receipt. So the oaks that had come down to pay for the father's monument went up as the roof over the father's tomb, and were bought and paid for, and were nobody's gift. The floor came up, and lay stacked in the churchyard all one summer, and the Ansell burials of 200 years lay open to the light under the tarpaulins, and Judith Ansell stood over them for a long time, on an evening in July with the register entry in her hand, and then had the pavement put back, and her father left where he was. When the lead work was finished, the position was as follows. Nothing whatever could be put back into that chancel without the written leave of the lay rector. Not the pews, not the vault stone, not the marble, not the Cranmere family seat with its fireplace and its curtain on brass rings, not the Cranmere dead, who were at that moment lying under a tarpaulin in a churchyard, waiting, he wrote twice, formally and correctly and generously. She answered both letters in 3 lines. The leave would be given in the churchyard, after service, in front of the parish and not otherwise, and not before. It was given on the first Sunday after the roof was leaded, on a bright, clear morning at the end of summer, on the gravel path between the south porch and the lych gate, with the whole of Wychmere standing on the grass and the churchwarden with his hand half over his mouth. Edmund, Duke of Cranmere, took off his hat and did not put it back on, and asked Miss Judith Ansell aloud, so that every soul in that churchyard heard it, for leave to put his father's back into the chancel of Wychmere. She let him finish. Then she gave the leave, and named the terms, and there were 3. Nothing further was ever to be cut into that floor. No new vault, no new brick, no new marble. His father went back exactly where he had been, and there it ended, and any Cranmere who came after must lie in the churchyard like the rest of the parish. Every seat in St. Chad's was to be free. The pew doors were to come off, all of them, and be burnt, and the ranking of the seats was to end, and the free bench under the tower was to go on the same fire. The Cranmere pew was to stay exactly where it stood, fireplace, curtain, and all, because she was not in the business of moving people out of their seats. And the blocked doorway in the north wall of the chancel, which had been walled up for 100 years, was to be opened, and the path to it made up in gravel from the lane. The way in for the Cranmere family, at every funeral, at every visitation, for as long as there were Cranmeres, would run along the north side, past the rank grass and the strangers' graves, and past one stone in particular. And the door to be hung in that opening was to be the door of the Ansell pew, which Job Hallett had had in his shop these 9 years, with the initials down. He agreed to all three, on the path, in front of everybody, without a word of negotiation. Then he asked her whether she would move her father in now, since the floor had been up and could be raised again by a mason in a morning, and he would pay for it himself. And Judith Ansell said no, and said why, in a voice that carried further than she intended. Her father had lain 9 winters on the north side, among the strangers and the paupers, and moving him now would be an admission that lying there had been a disgrace. It had not been a disgrace. It had only been the north side. He would stay where the parish walked, and the Cranmeres could come past him on their way in. The door was hung the following week. Job Hallett planed 9 years of glue and candle grease off it, and found the oak underneath as black and hard as iron, and the 2 letters cut into it with a knife by a man dead 200 years, still there, deep as the day they were made. The Duke of Cranmere carried one end of it across the churchyard himself in a black, superfine tailcoat, and held it up in the opening while Hallett drove the pins into the hinges, which took 9 minutes, and which he did not once complain about. When it was done, he stood back and put his hand flat on the panel, over the letters, and asked whose they were. She told him the name. "I said in that church that a name is not a freehold," he said. "You did. I have had 9 years of being told otherwise," said the Duke of Cranmere, "and it has cost me every one of them, and I would give a great deal to have looked up once, at the beginning, and asked whose seat it was." She did not answer him, and she did not forgive him, and she went in through her own door to look at her own roof. On the Monday after Michaelmas, the tithe barn doors stood open, and the parish came through them one at a time, and the book was called in order, and the last name in it was Cranmere. He came himself. He stood in the barn between Dunning the shoemaker and the miller's man, with his hat under his arm, and waited his turn, and paid £380 for the home farm, the downland and the lay plantations, and took his receipt and thanked her for it. He did that twice a year for the rest of his life, and never once sent an agent. The bond was discharged in 11 years. The crimson shawl wore through at the shoulders, and was turned and mended and wore through again. Judith Ansell was buried, when her time came, outside the north wall, beside her father, by her own written direction, in ground that drained. And the Dukes of Cranmere have gone in to their dead ever since by the north door of the chancel of Wychmere, along the gravel, past the rank grass, past 2 flat stones on the shadowed side, and through a black oak door with a dead man's initials cut into it, which every one of them has had to put his hand on to push open.